By the summer of 1944, Allied troops were racing towards Paris. The final phase of the war in Europe was about to be played out. The Western Allies were squeezing in on Germany through France. The Soviet Union was approaching from the east. Hitler, caught in the middle, made a last, desperate attempt to break out of the Allied stranglehold. While he was doing so, Stalin was beginning to redraw the political map of Europe in an attempt to secure the Soviet Union's future. But as the Russians now advanced into German-occupied territory, they came across the most shocking discovery in modern history. A series of camps that would call into question the very nature of humanity. The world was about to discover the true horror of the Nazi regime. In August 1944, Allied troops arrived in Paris. Even as Hitler desperately signaled to his generals, "Is Paris burning?" the German forces occupying the city surrendered.
Paris free again, and the beginning of the last act in its amazing story. The surrender of Lieutenant General von Choltitz, German commander of the Paris region. At a dingy office in Montparnasse station, formal end of German rule.
Paris threw itself into an orgy of celebration. The following day, Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French government in exile, arrived in the city to claim the glory for its liberation.
Paris, Paris outragé, Paris brisé, Paris martyrisé, mais Paris libéré, libéré par lui-même.
Meanwhile, as de Gaulle claimed the credit, the Allies continued the fighting. They crossed the River Seine and moved east towards Germany. As they did so, the German army was retreating in confusion. But the Allies were running into severe logistical problems. The fleeing Germans had trashed the French ports. That meant Allied supplies had to be brought in from Britain across the beaches of Normandy and then transported several hundreds of miles along tortuous roads. Truck convoys, nicknamed the Red Ball Express from their identification sign, rolled forward day and night. But it was impossible to bring in enough supplies, particularly fuel, to maintain the Allied advance. A US armored division drank up to 25,000 gallons of fuel a day. Meanwhile, as supply problems slowed the Allied advance, Hitler was planning a new fightback. His plan? To destroy Allied morale by attacking civilian targets, particularly in Britain. His method? A new miracle weapon, the flying bomb. On June the 13th, 1944, 10 were fired at London. 6 struck home. The Germans called it Vengeance Weapon 1, the V1. The British simply called it the Doodlebug. Armed with a warhead of just under 2,000 pounds, it could be launched from sites 130 miles away and could fly at 400 miles an hour. For the next few weeks, up to 100 Doodlebugs a day were fired at British cities from launch sites along the German-occupied Channel coast. They caused panic and confusion. More than 20,000 people were killed or wounded. The British set up a screen of anti-aircraft guns around the capital. The British also sent up fighters to intercept them, including their first operational jet, the Gloucester Meteor. But still, the V-1s kept arriving. Only when the Allies tracked down their launch sites in northern France did they stop. But the reprieve was only temporary. The Germans had a second miracle weapon up their sleeves. Hard on the heels of the V-1 came the much more sophisticated V-2 rocket. The first fell on London on September the 8th, 1944. The V-2s were launched from easily concealed mobile launchers 200 miles away. They traveled at 3,500 miles an hour and carried a 1-ton warhead. For 6 months, Britain had no response. Over 1,100 V-2s landed on defenseless British cities. They only stopped when the German positions in Europe were pushed so far back, the launch sites were, once again, out of range of Britain. Yet, despite the horror and damage the V-2s caused, British morale remained unbroken. Meanwhile, in mainland Europe, the Allied advance reached Brussels on September the 3rd, 1944. The next day, British forces took the huge Belgian port of Antwerp. It was still intact. Here, at last, seemed an answer to the Allies' logistic problems. New supplies could pour in through the port. But it was not to be so simple. Antwerp is 40 miles from the sea, up the River Scheldt. As the Germans pulled out of the city, they dug in along the waterway, turning it into a corridor of death. The river was also mined. It meant the port was unreachable from the sea. The Allied advance, now desperately low on supplies, was in danger of grinding to a halt.